Welcome to GTR East Africa 2021 Virtual. I'm Ted George, founder and Chief Narrative Officer of Kleos Advisory, and I'm delighted to be involved once again in this year's conference. In this welcome video, I will let you know what to expect from the conference and the digital platform, and I will give a short keynote on the outlook for economic growth and trade in East Africa. We all look forward to meeting in person in the near future, but for now we are fully digital. And GTR have developed a platform that gets the most out of this format. Please watch the demo on the conference platform which accompanies this video. This shows how to personalize the agenda to your own calendar and how to connect with speakers, attendees, and our sponsors who will have virtual stands in the sponsor hub. The conference includes a mixture of pre-recorded sessions which are available on demand, such as this welcome video, as well as live panel discussions. For the live panels, we welcome your questions. Please submit them via the Q&A button, and the moderators will answer as many of them as they can. Once each session is over, you can continue your engagement with the panelists in the speaker chat rooms. You'll be directed to these after each session. All sessions from the conference will be available on demand on this platform afterwards, so if you miss one, you can catch up at your leisure. Please make sure to fill in the evaluation form. There's a button for that on the landing page. And why not take the GTR challenge, which is another incentive to use the GTR platform as much as possible. Whoever wins this challenge will get an Apple Watch, and the winner will be announced at the end of the conference. So, what do we have in GTR East Africa 2021 Virtual? On day one, we have a mix of live and pre-recorded sessions, starting with a keynote by Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Africa, Emma Wade-Smith, on the outlook for East Africa's trade and investment. And there are panels on the COVID response, supply chain finance, fraud risk, and structured LCs, and a discussion I will be moderating where we will assess the strengths and limitations of trade tech to facilitate cross-border trade. On day two, we have panels on economic diversification, SME trade finance, and export credit finance, with the second half of the day dedicated to the ACT East Africa Treasury Forum. All times on the agenda are East Africa time, which is GMT +3. I hope you can join as many of the sessions as possible. And now, to set the scene, I'd like to give a short presentation, taking the pulse of East Africa's economy and trade flows, and looking at some of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead of us this year. Many of these issues will be discussed during the conference. So how badly was East Africa affected by COVID? Well, quite badly, even if not as badly as other regions of the world like North America or India or Brazil. This chart from March by the IOM shows that there were over 365,000 cases and over 5,000 deaths. The epicenter remains in Ethiopia, which has nearly half of all cases, and followed by Kenya with around a third, and an important caseload as well in Uganda. The one thing which doesn't look clear about this map is the number of reported cases in Tanzania, which seems unusually low. And of course, that reflects the collecting of data in that country. Now, even though it hasn't been that bad in terms of the numbers, if you consider the size of the population and how long the pandemic has been running, there are still concerns in East Africa over a rising number of new variants. We've already seen the Kent variant, the Indian variant, Brazilian variant, and there are concerns there are other African variants which are circulating as well. According to the latest data in early May, regional infections passed 500,000, led by Ethiopia and Kenya. And so there is a real concern. We are not out of the woods yet. The COVID does have a foothold in this region. It's going to very much depend on how governments and international organizations fight to arrest any further spread of the virus. Now, the impact that this has had on GDP and inflation has been huge, particularly when you look at GDP growth. If you look at the bar chart on the left there, East Africa's GDP fell off a cliff in 2020. It was down 2% regionally. And in fact, tourism-dependent economies slumped by 11.5% there. But it's important to bear in mind that the COVID really showed a lot of the resilience of East Africa's economy. We've already seen estimates for 2020 growth to have been revised upwards. So they expected a much larger drop in GDP, but in fact, it's going to be relatively small. And the reality is both the IMF and the AfDB are forecasting a rebound of 3.4% in 2021, which should be buoyed by the return of tourism, higher commodity prices, and the easing of lockdowns. When it comes to inflation, inflation had been rising, particularly for landlocked countries before the pandemic broke out, but it appears to have been more or less stable Only slight increases expected in Rwanda. And this may be the fact that actually, as we see lockdown restrictions easing, we see a return of movement of more goods that should help dampen inflationary pressures. When it comes to one of the big questions is what kind of impact did lockdowns have? Because it's a very contentious issue as well, particularly as lockdowns were much more severe in countries such as South Africa or Kenya than they were in Tanzania, which sits between them. This data from the African Development Bank, which tracks growth rate against the lockdown stringency index, really shows quite clearly from the dotted lines there that GDP growth and industrial production really do fall when you have a more severe lockdown. You can see also the difference of the policies for East Africa. If you look to the extreme right, Kenya and Uganda are very clearly not growing, and they have the most stringent of lockdowns. If you look to the extreme left, Tanzania, 5% growth in the first half of last year and a much looser lockdown. But what is interesting is there is a few anomalies on here. If you look sort of towards the top right, you can see Rwanda actually had almost 5% growth in industrial production, even though it had one of the tightest lockdown regimes. And that just goes to show that it very much depends individually on how countries work, how they can manage their way through this crisis. Now, the effect that COVID has had on debt has been huge as well. And this is obviously no surprise. It's been the same all around the world as well. Africa's fiscal deficits doubled in 2020 to around 8.4% of GDP. And certainly if you look at the chart there on the left as well, the level of debt to GDP is rising rapidly. In Africa, it's expected to go from around 60% before the pandemic to 70 to 75%. And where the real concern here is that there's been a shift away from traditional lenders towards private and commercial debt. This is creating a huge debt bubble. And if, as is inevitable, there will need to be restructuring and some haircuts, commercial and private lenders are unlikely to be as accommodating as multilaterals. And this is something which could be very complex to disentangle if the world economy doesn't respond with a full rebound, as everyone hopes this year. When it comes to the levels of debt distress, the chart there on the top right by the African Development Bank, there are a lot of countries which are facing debt distress. The FDB rates 6 of them as currently in debt distress, 14 at a high risk, and 16 with moderate risk. Or put another way, the green ones there of low risk, that's just 2 out of 33. So there is a real concern about how the managing of debt will be handled for East Africa and all of Africa over the next few years, bearing in mind that huge amount of debt that developing countries have also, or developed countries have also put onto their balance sheet. But there's been something going on in the background, and I think this is important to note because this is really going to affect the outlook for growth and for trade. And that is the fact that, according to GSMA, last year, Africa passed the digital tipping point. And that means over half of the population now owns a mobile phone and has access to 3G or Wi-Fi. And this is hugely significant. We saw a huge surge in mobile payments during COVID-19, particularly in East Africa, which is one of the most digitally advanced parts of Africa. We've also seen a surge in the use of 3G and mobile apps. It's much easier to get phones nowadays. You can see there a photograph of a woman getting a techno handset. They're very popular all over Africa. And you can even buy them on hire purchase. There's a number of products out there. Lipa Mdogo is one in Kenya where you don't even have to do a down payment. You start paying 5 cents a day, you can get yourself a basic feature phone. And this is hugely significant because when it comes to the economic rebound, the ability of people to be innovative and do business when we have a lockdown, we're really seeing that this is having a transformation in terms of boosting business development, investment, boosting trade as well. And I think the digitalization of the economy is really going to help when it comes to the rebound and may give a bit of an upside to some of the numbers that we've been looking at over the next couple of years. But the reality is, I mean, what did all this have as an impact on trade? Well, the impact was huge, as it was across the world. The problem was the EAC was already on a declining trend of trade prior to COVID-19, and obviously trade slumped quite dramatically in 2020. But there is an outlier here, and that's Rwanda. You can see there the chart on the left, the green bars, growing very strongly when it comes to goods and services before COVID, and expects to rebound strongly as well. But all the other countries are expected a kind of a weak return to exports of goods and services, and that they will probably not be back at the level they were pre-COVID by the end of 2022. This is also reflected if you look at the regional picture, the chart there on the right. All regions were hit quite badly by COVID, particularly ECOWAS and COMESA, because of their strong dependence on commodities. But with the response in rising commodity prices, certainly rising demand for many key commodities, SADC and COMESA are expected to rebound quite strongly. The EAC only flatly. And it's going to need a bit more policy support as well to really get life back into the trade sector. But the other big issue, which is holding everything back, and I think it's something that, I've posted this slide a number of times over the years, but the problem has not gone away. Africa's trade finance gap remains huge. It's estimated at over $120 billion a year. And interregional trade, which is really, if you like, the lifeblood of the economy of so many people in Africa, gets just $60 billion of trade finance a year. Now, there are numerous reasons for the constraints. We've seen liquidity constraints, particularly at certain points during the pandemic. There is also the balance sheet confirmation limits of banks, because there has been some de-risking, the withdrawal of some banks from the trade finance space. There are less banks to confirm LCs, and this is clogging up the system. This really has to be addressed, the trade finance gap, and I think there's going to be a lot of discussions over the next few days about the kinds of different financing that is available to plug the different holes where they are. There are positive things to look forward to, particularly for trade this year. And one is, of course, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. That officially came into force in 2021. Now, it will take a number of years to integrate all of these markets, but the reality is every country, bar Eritrea, has signed up, and the process of ratification by national legislatures is ongoing. The big final missing piece there is Nigeria, but it's already advancing quite strongly in terms of the integration on paper. And we do expect to see there will be some disruption to integration measures caused by periodic border and port closures with COVID. But the truth is it's going ahead. And I think there are huge opportunities here, particularly for East Africa. One of the biggest is legalizing billions of dollars of informal trade flows. You see them, all these goods flowing over the borders in the region. Now they are legal, and there's an opportunity here for entrepreneurs on both sides of borders to supply communities on the other side and really open up commerce. There's a huge opportunity also to stamp out fraud and rent seeking at the ports. And I think this is something really important, because fraud in the value chain adds huge costs as well. It doesn't bring any benefit except to the people who are taking the money. And so that is going to be very key here. And particularly when there's the ability to export one good from an African market over multiple African countries without the need for sign off by different authorities along the way, hugely reduces the opportunities there for rent seeking. And I think the biggest possibility, of course, is this idea of building cross-border value chains, where you might have some of the goods semi-processed in your country, but finished in another neighboring country. Once you have the clearness of knowing that you're in a single market, it makes it much easier to make these kind of operations and tie them together. And I think that's where there can be real benefit for everyone. But there is one big challenge hanging over all of this, and it's becoming very significant. And this is that compliance standards are set to tighten, and perhaps draconially. ESG, only a few years ago, was seen as a nice to have. It is now taking center stage because scrutiny of global supply chains is intensifying, and the consequences are, it's not really just about sustainability now, we're talking about compliance. The UK has led the way. Last year, it launched a consultation on a new law, which will require due diligence on all imported commodities linked to deforestation risk, and that includes palm oil, rubber, soya, beef, cocoa, and leather, affecting many people operating in trade in soft commodities in East Africa. California is in the process of introducing its California Deforestation-Free Procurement Act. Other states could follow suit. And the EU is proposing perhaps the most radical laws, the EU Parliament, which would prevent products linked with deforestation and nature destruction from entering European markets. So there is a real imperative for action by everyone who works in the commodity value chain to address the fact that these compliance standards are going to be tightening very severely in the coming years, and we need to respond. And I believe one of the tools that would enable us to meet these ESG targets will be technology. Trade tech, agri-tech, nature tech, if you want to call it that, is now already giving a level of insight into the value chain, which was unimaginable only 10 years ago. If you look top left, drones are standard in many plantations. This one is from a tea plantation in Tanzania. They can check areas, see how the crop is going on. If there's an area that needs spraying, more importantly, they can tell you where areas don't need spraying. And there's so much they can do about monitoring biodiversity in the area. The bottom left, that's cocoa warehouse in the countryside. The worker there weighs the bag of cocoa. The farmer there has already scanned his code into the PDA. The weight of the cocoa, the information is fed to the PDA. She then scans the tag on there on the cocoa, and it can be tracked the entire way through the system. And that really is very important when it comes to traceability and knowing who you're getting your supply from. If you look at what the tech can be, how the tech can crunch all the different numbers as well. If you look on bottom right, that's company PCR. That is a map of the different cocoa farms that they've been tracking. And that enables them to know that if they are in the correct areas and not in protected forest area. And if you put all of the technology together, including some of the latest satellite data, you get what you have at the top right. That is a screenshot from Satelligence, which is a US satellite and AI company. And they've crunched all the data there. And that is looking at a protected forest area surrounded by legal cocoa plantation. The purple color there is sun-fed cocoa. The light green is canopy cocoa. And the deep green is the protected forest area. And what's clear from this map is it is being protected. And you can see if there's any encroachments, you know exactly who's done it, and you have all the necessary information. Tech is never a silver bullet. It's very complicated to implement, but it has advanced so far just in the last 5 years. And I really think all of these elements together will enable, they will be integrated into the value chain, and they need to be part of an international value chain. If East Africa is not only going to increase trade with its neighbors, but remain part of international trade itself. Thank you. Well, that's all we have time for. I look forward to seeing you online at GTR East Africa Virtual, and I encourage you all to engage on the platform. We want this conference to be as interactive as possible. If you'd like to get in touch with me about any of the issues discussed today, I can be reached via the conference platform or on LinkedIn. Enjoy the conference.